I'm Hayden Blackman. I am the studio head and creative director at Hangar 13, and we're working on Mafia 3.
President-elect Nixon. Violent clashes.
Where did the idea for Mafia 3 come from, kind of a new twist on the Mafia series?
When we were first offered the opportunity at Hangar 13 to work on the Mafia franchise, we knew, well, we knew we really wanted to, but we knew we wanted to stay true to the two things that we think are most important to the franchise: the sense of time and place, and the really compelling story. And those are both elements that we think the franchise is well known for. But we did want to do something a little bit different. We wanted to put our own stamp on it. So we knew we wanted to move forward in time. We wanted to focus on a new city, and we wanted a new type of protagonist. And really, in some ways, to reclaim the name Mafia to mean more than just the Italian mob, right? And that's really where all those kind of notions all came together, and that's where we focused on a new protagonist, Lincoln Clay, who's mixed race and a Vietnam vet, a new city, New Orleans, which again is a very iconic city. That's our inspiration for the city in our game. And then 1968, so which again, incredibly turbulent time in American history. The civil rights movement in full swing, a lot of high-profile assassinations, Vietnam raging, and then you also have incredible cars and music at the same time.
Lincoln's part of the Black Mob. Did you have to do a lot of research into that? 'Cause it's something I wasn't even aware of.
Yeah, we've done a copious amount of research for this game, not just in terms of the setting, but also to make sure that we're being authentic in terms of the story, right? So we've done a ton of research on the various different mob groups that were sometimes cooperating and sometimes competing with each other, not just in areas like New Orleans, but all over the country. The Black Mob was a group, and there were several versions of the Black Mob depending on which city you were in. And they did things like run numbers. They started pushing heroin for the Italian mob in some cities, and we've drawn kind of some elements from all that research to kind of inform our group that Lincoln's part of early in this game.
So presumably there was real warfare between the two, the Italian Mafia and the Black Mob.
Yeah, there was absolutely conflict between the Italian mob and other groups, not just even the Black Mob, and then other conflict between all the different gangs that were competing for control of various cities. And again, a lot of it had to do in the late 60s with control of things like heroin and the heroin supply. So we touch on that, actually. That is a theme that runs through the game. The other thing that was really interesting about the late 60s, which for us, we didn't really know until we started doing research, but it really was kind of the end of the golden age of the mob in some respects, at least in the way that people viewed the mob. It was no longer really this kind of romanticized kind of social club, and in fact, it was only a few years earlier that people even acknowledged, like the FBI even acknowledged, that the mob existed at all. So we're using that as well as the kind of end of the golden era of the mob and kind of the rise of the new breed of criminal. We also deal with things like the Irish gangs. There is an Irish mobster in the story who serves as one of your lieutenants. There were Haitian gangs in the South that actually competed with groups like the Black Mob for control over the local lotteries, what we call numbers running, and that's an element in our game. And then there's always warring factions between different mob groups within even the Italian mob, and we actually have a little bit of that as well. So we try to pour all that into it, but at the end of the day, we just want to tell a really cool, authentic, compelling story. So, some of this we're obviously taking creative license with too.
And you have Vito Scaletta as part of your crew, who obviously people know from Mafia 2. How does he end up working with Lincoln?
Yeah, so Vito's a really interesting character. Vito Scaletta is the main character from Mafia 2. He comes back and he plays a really big role in Mafia 3. Depending on some of the player choices, actually, there are ways that you could play the game where Vito's role is not maybe as pronounced, but he's always important and he's always in there. So the deal with Vito is that at the end of Mafia 2, he kind of gets sent away for his own protection. He doesn't always view it that way. He views that he's been kind of cast out, but he gets sent down to our version in New Orleans, and the mob boss, this guy Sal Marcano, who runs the city, is told, hey, you got to take this guy into your organization. Well, Sal sees Vito as like a carpetbagger, like some guy that's been sent down here maybe to spy on him. He doesn't really trust him. He never really liked Vito because he sees him as an outsider, even though they're all part of the Italian mob. So Sal kind of sidelines him and says, okay, you can control this part of the city, but it's really like this small wharf area of the city, and Vito's office is literally above a fish restaurant, and he looks out at the downtown area, so he's looking out at the jewel of the city across the water, but he doesn't have a part of it. So over the years, he gets bitter about this and more increasingly frustrated by the fact that Sal's not letting him do more and more. And then so when the Black Mob is betrayed by the Italian mob and Lincoln goes looking for allies, Vito's a guy that he goes and recruits because he knows that Vito, wants more and has been bitter towards the mob for so long. So it's kind of that my enemy is my friend thing. But then Vito's been really fun to write, and he's been really fun to include in the game because he's kind of a complex character, and he does. He's a criminal too, but he's not unlikable. I think over time, again, depending on how much you invest in Vito and how much time you spend with Vito, there's a mutual respect that builds between those two guys. I mean, Lincoln's always in charge. He's the guy you're playing. But the more that Lincoln gives to Vito, the more that kind of respect grows.
Cool. One of the things I really noticed about the presentation as well was the soundtrack. All these iconic pieces of music. Obviously that was important, but just how important was it to pick the right tracks?
So 1968 is an incredible time for music, right? And then you set the game in a city like New Orleans, and you have this crazy crush of music where you've got jazz and you got Dixie and you got blues, you got R&B, you've got the beginnings of punk in 1968, so I think we had the Kinks in there. You got the Rolling Stones. There's so much great music coming out in the late 60s that we had to include that. And audio is half the experience, right? And I think music is probably half of that again. So it was really important to us to handpick a few songs for this first unveiling of the game that would really remind you that you're in 1968 and in New Orleans. I mean, we have some jazz playing and some things like that. And the final game, the soundtrack, will be a little less predictable because you'll be listening to stuff on the radio, and we will be having music cycle through various venues as you're walking by, so you won't know what song is going to be playing as you walk by a club or whatnot. But we put a lot of time and effort and care into making sure that we had the right songs, not just for this demo but for the game as a whole. Your
background was originally in movies and comic books, right? So how did that inform your work on developing Mafia 3?
Yeah, so I started in games. I started out as a writer before I got into games and did some writing and wrote some books and that were published. But then I started pretty early in my career, pretty soon after college in games as a writer. But since then I've done a lot of other freelance stuff, and I'm still a freelance comic book writer, and I did work at LucasArts and worked on a number of Star Wars titles. So at my heart, I think I'm a writer by training. For me, that's really important in games. I always gravitate towards games that have strong narrative components. But again, at Hangar 13, one of our mantras is every player's story is unique. And really what that means is we want the players to become co-authors in the experience overall. So while we do have a really strong central narrative and we build up this character of Lincoln, the narrative is really meant to be a series of tent poles that you kind of go through, but in between that, all this other stuff can happen. And even the way that those tentpole moments play out will vary pretty differently from player to player as they go through the game. Again, if you invest all your time in Vito and give Vito all the territory, and I try and spread the wealth a little bit more, I guarantee we're going to have dramatically different gameplay experiences because you're going to have access to different types of services than I will. I might have a better breadth of service, but you're going to have more powerful services, as one example. So from a gameplay standpoint, our stories will be different for sure, but then the narrative is going to take some pretty big twists and turns based on that as well. Your interaction with Vito is going to be different than mine, and I guarantee your interaction with Burke, the Irish gangster, is going to be incredibly different than mine because you've given him nothing.
I noticed in the demo as well that Lincoln is pretty brutal. with the executions and things. Was there a reason for that? That he's so violent?
Well, we really wanted. We have this. One of our game pillars is own the battlefield, right? So we wanted Lincoln to feel like a trained soldier going to war against the kind of mob bullies, right, and really taking it to them. So that is one way you can play the game, right? We do have non-lethal takedowns in the game, so if you so choose as a player, you can go through the game and do non-lethal takedowns. There's actually ways to take over hideouts without killing the hideout boss. So we do support that play style, but again, we're not shying away from the fact that this is a hard-boiled game. It's a very violent, turbulent time in American history, right? Lincoln is a criminal waging a war against other really violent criminals too, right? So we're trying to give you context for all that. At the same time, we are tracking also kind of, and we're not talking too much about it yet, but under the hood, we're tracking what we call notoriety. And this is, how does Lincoln interact with the rest of the world? So we're not punishing you for killing mobsters because that's, Lincoln is on this revenge quest. If you decide to play that way, that's fine by us, right? But we don't want you to go out into the world necessarily and commit wanton acts of violence against civilians or even the police, even though in the game we established the police are pretty corrupt in this version of New Orleans and this version of 1968. But we don't want you to go out there in the world and necessarily engage in that wanton violence without there being some consequence. And interestingly enough, a lot of the consequences revolve around your relationships with your three lieutenants, because although they're criminals, they're aware that your actions have impact on them and can either hurt the impression that others have of them or their ability to even earn. So.
In the demo as well, we saw quite a few racial aspects. Obviously, you say turbulent time in the 1968. Saw a couple being harassed by the police. Is Lincoln going to be subjected to the same kind of harassment from the authorities?
Yes, again, we're trying to be as authentic as possible. We're not getting up on a soapbox, but we are trying to be as authentic as possible and not shying away from the fact that he's mixed race, but he looks black. We actually have a line in the game where another black character is talking about him and says, if he looks black, he's going to be treated like he's black in most of the city, and that's what happens. So a lot of that comes into play with both the police and with civilians, with pedestrians, or patrons in some of our public fronts. So one of the things we showed in the demo here at Gamescom is this drug den that's hidden underneath a jazz club. That jazz club is a public front that the mob operates to kind of mask their illegal activities. If Lincoln goes in there and he's waving around his gun, or if he's trying to sneak around, people are going to take notice of that and they're going to call the cops, or they're going to alert the mobsters. But there, Lincoln doesn't stand out very much because it's a jazz club, right? So it's a mixed race club to begin with. When he walks in there, he sees white people, black people, so he doesn't stand out as much. I guarantee there are going to be places that Lincoln will walk into in the game where he does stand out because he is black, and he is the only black character in there. Just like there'll be places where he stands out even less because there's no white characters in there because it's a bar, nestled in the kind of black community in the game. So again, we're trying not to be too heavy-handed with it, but we want to make you think a little bit about race, from time to time, and make sure that you're aware of it when you go into certain situations, and it was a part of the time, and so we're not going to shy away from it at all.
Well, Mafia 3 is quite a different game to the other two. What single feature would you say you're most excited to get into players' hands?
That's a really good question. So on the moment-to-moment level, I'm really excited for people to drive in the game. I think, I'm really happy and satisfied with where we're at with cover combat. I think that's going to be really compelling as well. I feel like, the game will be a best-in-class, cover shooter in the open world, which I feel is very fresh and new and hasn't really been done before, at least not in this context. So that's great, but the driving model is just stellar, and it feels different than any other game because it's this physics-based driving model. But then I think there's this thing, when you play the game for about an hour or two, you start to feel how different the experience can be based on how you're playing. And then when you start assigning hideouts and districts out, and you start realizing that, I have, these series of key choices I'm going to have to make through the game, and I'm going to be continually tempted to trade power over my relationships, that I think is going to be pretty compelling too. Mafia 3 will be coming out in 2016 for PC, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One.